I'll never forget that day, though I wish I could. It was a typical Thursday afternoon, just one more class before we were all free to go. I was in history, third row, near the door. Our teacher, Mrs. Lewis, was lecturing us about World War II, her voice droning on in the way only history teachers seem to master. My eyes were heavy, barely focusing on the slide about D-Day, when suddenly the PA system crackled on. Attention students and staff. We are entering a lockdown. This is not a drill. My stomach dropped. The whole room tensed up. You could feel it like a charge in the air. Mrs. Lewis paused, her hand frozen on the chalkboard, and then she nodded, more to herself than anyone, like she was collecting her thoughts. Everyone stay calm. Move to the back wall, away from the door. We shuffled to the back of the room, squeezing together in silence. Mrs. Lewis turned off all the lights, and the only light came from the soft glow of the street lamps outside. She locked the door and pulled down the blinds, moving as quietly as she could, as if the slightest noise could betray our presence. I was sitting between two of my classmates, Kayla and Trevor, both as pale as ghosts. Kayla reached out and grabbed my hand. Her fingers were cold and trembling. Seconds turned into minutes. We heard nothing, just the eerie quiet of a school brought to a standstill. Then we heard footsteps in the hallway. Each step echoed, getting closer and closer to our front door. Trevor squeezed his eyes shut, and Kayla's grip tightened, practically crushing my hand. We all held our breaths. The footsteps stopped, right outside our door. I dared to glance up, and in the thin sliver of light beneath the door, I could see a shadow. Someone was standing there. My mind raced. Was it a police officer, the principal, or worse, someone else? Then the doorknob rattled. A quiet metallic scrape. Someone was trying to get in. Mrs. Lewis raised a finger to her lips, signaling us to stay silent. We were all terrified, but no one dared to make a sound. Then the rattling stopped, but the shadow didn't move. It just stood there. Seconds turned into an eternity, and I could feel my palms sweating, my heartbeat roaring in my ears. And then the strangest thing happened. The person outside started humming. It was soft, almost a whisper, but I could make it out. An off-key, haunting melody. It wasn't any tune I was familiar with. It was more like a lullaby twisted into something sinister. The humming grew louder, filling the silence of the room, seeping into our bones. Kayla's hand shook even more, and I could feel Trevor trembling beside me. We were all on edge, ready to break. Finally, the humming stopped. For a moment, I thought it was over. But then the door handle rattled again, more violently this time. Whoever it was, they were trying harder to break inside our classroom. Mrs. Lewis's eyes were wide now, her knuckles white as she held onto the edge of her desk, like it was the only thing keeping her grounded. After a few more tense seconds, the rattling stopped for good. The footsteps retreated, fading down the hallway, the humming echoing behind them, softer and softer, until it was gone. We waited, still too scared to move. I don't know how long we sat there, huddled in the dark. Maybe minutes, maybe an hour. Eventually, the PA system crackled back on to life. Students and staff, the lockdown is over. Teachers, please resume your classes. None of us moved. Mrs. Lewis stayed by the door, listening for any sounds outside. She didn't turn the lights back on, didn't say a word. It was like we were all waiting for someone else to tell us it was safe. Finally, the bell rang, and we stumbled out of the classroom, still shaken about what just happened. We made our way to the exit, every shadow, every sound making me jump. As we filed out of the school, I saw a few police cars in the parking lot, lights flashing but no sirens. Later that night, I found out no one knew who it was that tried to get into our classroom. No one had seen anything suspicious on the cameras. The police didn't find anyone in the building. But that humming, I'll never forget it. Every now and then, when I'm alone in my room at night, I swear I can still hear it. That twisted lullaby drifting through the silence, as if it's still out there, waiting. It started like any other school day. I was sitting in math class, halfway through a worksheet, when the PA system crackled on, and the principal's voice, usually calm and upbeat, said in a low, serious tone, "Attention all students and staff. We are now under lockdown. This is not a drill. I repeat, this is not a drill. Please follow all protocols immediately." We'd had lockdown drills before, but something about his voice made the hair on my arm stand up. Mr. Grayson, our math teacher, didn't hesitate. He quickly shut off the lights, locked the door, and motioned us to the corner of the room, away from the windows. We all huddled together, a mix of confusion and fear on everyone's faces. It was dead silent. Then we heard it. A faint scraping sound coming from the hallway. It was so quiet that I thought maybe I was just imagining it. But then I saw a couple of my classmates' heads turn, eyes wider with alarm. The sound got louder, like something heavy being dragged down the floor, slow and steady. Mr. Grayson put a finger to his lips, his eyes locked on the door. We all held our breath. The scraping sound stopped, replaced by a low, guttural sound, almost like breathing, but rough and labored, like whoever was out there was struggling for air. I dared peek a glance at the door, my pulse racing. We all knew not to go near it, but the shadow that appeared beneath the doorframe made my heart stop. It was a misshapen silhouette, long and uneven, like someone dragging themselves along. The shadow paused, lingering right outside the door, almost like it was listening, trying to hear what was inside our classroom. One of my best friends, Jenna, was sitting next to me. She had her hands clamped over her mouth, eyes locked on that shadow. I reached over, grabbed her hand, and held on tight. Suddenly, the shadow shifted, and something hit the door with a loud thud. Everyone jumped. The breathing got louder, more ragged, like the person outside was getting angrier, desperate. Another thud, even harder this time. I felt Jenna's grip tighten, and I was sure I could hear someone behind me quietly start to cry. Mr. Grayson glanced back at us, and I could see the tension in his face. He mouthed to us, "Stay silent." The door shook with another hard impact, as if whoever was out there was throwing themselves against it. The thought of that flimsy lock holding up against whatever force was on the other side seemed almost impossible. My mind raced, trying to think of what could be happening, but it was all a blur of panic. Then, just as suddenly as it started, everything went quiet. The shadow outside the door shifted, moving slowly away from the frame. The breathing faded down the hall, and for a second I thought it was over. I let out a small breath, only to hear a whisper from the very far side of the room. One of the kids had pulled out their phone and was furiously typing. I couldn't help it. I leaned over to read what they were texting, but all I saw was, "Did you see it?" I froze, but curiosity got the best of me. I opened my phone to check the school group chat. Messages were pouring in, everyone trying to figure out what was going on. Then a photo popped up, and it made my blood run cold. It was grainy, taken through a classroom window looking out into the parking lot. But there, standing near the edge of the parking lot, was someone. Tall, thin, and bent at odd angles, like their bones didn't fit under their skin. They were facing the school, arms hanging limply at their sides, just standing there. Someone else sent another photo, this one even closer, and the details were more clear. Their skin was stretched tight, grayish, and cracked, with hollow eyes that seemed to stare straight into the camera. Whatever this thing was watching us. A message flashed across the group chat. It's inside. I looked at the door, half expecting to see that same hollow-eyed figure standing there, but it was just Mr. Grayson keeping an eye out. We were trapped. That thing was out there, prowling the halls, and I had no idea how many doors it would try. The PA system crackled on again, and this time, it wasn't Mr. Alvarez's voice. It was a voice I didn't recognize. Thin and broken, whispering just loud enough for us to hear. Why are you hiding? Every muscle in my body tensed. The voice was shaky, distorted, like it was struggling to form words. But the intent was clear. It wanted us to come out, to see it. Jenna's grip on my hand was so tight I could barely feel my own fingers. I squeezed back, hoping it would somehow keep both of us grounded, as if clinging to each other could keep us safe from whatever was lurking outside. The voice faded, leaving only silence in its place. Minutes passed, then a full 15. After what felt like an eternity, the PA system crackled back on, and Mr. Alvarez's real voice came through. Shaky, but unmistakably his. Attention all students and staff. The lockdown is now over. Teachers, please resume classes. You may proceed with dismissal. The tension in the room didn't break. None of us dared to move. Mr. Grayson kept his hand on the door, listening, before finally taking a deep breath and unlocking it. He opened it just a crack, peeking outside into the hallway, and after a moment, he gave us the thumbs up it was good to go. We filed out of the hallway, everyone tense, glancing at one another with wide eyes. As we exited the building, I saw the teachers gathered in clusters, whispering to each other, a few looking over their shoulders nervously. The police had arrived, but there were no answers. To this day, no one knows who or what it was, and no one wants to talk about it. But as I walked away from the school that afternoon, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had watched us, that it was still watching, waiting for the next time we'd be alone. The announcement came over the PA system halfway through English class. Attention all students and staff. We are now in lockdown. This is not a drill. A chill ran down my spine as our teacher, Mrs. Cummings, hurried to lock the door and turned off the lights. I could hear the urgency in her voice as she whispered for us to move to the corner of the room, away from any windows. But then, just as if it was on cue, we heard it, a loud bang from the end of the hallway. My heart pounded, and I exchanged a terrified glance with my friend Matt, who was sitting next to me. Another bang, closer this time. It sounded like someone was slamming doors open, one after another, getting closer with every crash. Mrs. Cummings motioned for us to stay quiet, but I was shaking, adrenaline running throughout me. I couldn't take it. I needed to get out of this classroom. Without thinking, I stood up and whispered, "I have to go to the bathroom." She shot me a panicked look, but I didn't wait for an answer. I slipped outside the classroom, closing the door as quietly as I could behind me, and started down the hall toward the bathroom. As I crept along, I heard heavy footsteps coming from the other end of the corridor, followed by a low, muttering voice. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was menacing, and my heart dropped. I could see a figure in the distance. He was a man, tall and unkempt, dressed in ragged clothes, his movements erratic. He looked around wildly, like he was searching for something or someone. Panic set in, and I darted into the nearest bathroom, praying he hadn't seen me. I locked myself in the last stall, crouching on top of the toilet seat, trying to make myself as small as possible. I held my breath, ears straining to hear any sound. Then the bathroom door creaked open. My blood went cold as I heard his footsteps echo on the tile floor. He was muttering to himself, a strange, raspy voice saying things I couldn't quite fully understand, but I caught words like "find" and "they can't hide." He sounded unhinged, unpredictable. Every nerve in my body was screaming at me to run, but I stayed frozen, praying he'd leave. The footsteps grew louder as he moved from stall to stall, pushing open each door one by one. Bang, the first door. Bang, the second. He was getting closer to my stall, and I knew he'd reach me soon. I pressed my hand over my mouth, desperately trying to stifle my own breathing. Bang, another stall door. I could see his shadow beneath the door, and I shut my eyes, hoping that maybe if I couldn't see him, he couldn't see me. But then, I heard him stop right outside my stall. The handle jiggled, and I clenched my fists, bracing myself for whatever was about to come inside. But then, silence. I didn't hear him move. It was like he was just standing there, waiting. The seconds stretched out, each one feeling like an eternity. Then, just when I thought he'd moved on, he spoke. "I know you're in there. Come out wherever you are." My heart felt like it was going to burst open into a million pieces. He rattled the handle again, harder this time, almost as if he was daring me to make a sound. I stayed silent, pressing myself even closer to the wall, feeling every inch of the cold tile behind me. Finally, he let out a frustrated growl and banged on the door with his fist. "Fine. You can't hide here forever." Then I heard his footsteps retreat, and then mercifully, the bathroom door creaked shut. I stayed in that stall, frozen for what felt like hours, listening for any sound, any hint that he might come back. Eventually, I heard the faint sounds of people moving outside the bathroom door, voices echoing in the hallway. I unlocked the stall and crept out, glancing around to make sure he was gone before I finally bolted out of the bathroom and came back to my classroom. When I got back, I saw my English teacher, Mrs. Cummings, and my classmates pale and shaken up. They'd heard the footsteps too, heard him coming down the hall. The police had finally arrived, but by then, the man was gone. They never found him. And even now, whenever I'm alone in a quiet place, I can still hear his voice in my head, whispering those chilling words. "You can't hide forever."